All right, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Bharath Sethuraman as a guest speaker for Site 203 Brain and Behavior. Thank you, Bharath, for agreeing to give a talk for our psychology students. Let me give a brief introduction to the speaker, and then I'll read out the abstract of the talk, and then I'll let Bharath take control of the talk today. Bharath Sethuraman is a professor of mathematics at Krea University. He has deep interest in dementia, having been a primary caregiver for over 7 years to a very close family member who suffered from the condition. He is hoping to bring awareness of dementia-related issues to the Krea community and is exploring the possibility of co-teaching courses with a psychology major in dementia care and more generally geriatric psychology. That's about the speaker. About the talk today, dementia is a body of symptoms involving progressive loss of cognition and motor skills. In this talk, we will give an overview of dementia with a focus on dementia care. After reviewing the common symptoms, we will look at some of the underlying disease processes in the brain that are responsible for these symptoms. We will then turn to various stages of dementia and what these stages entail for the caregiver and other family members. Management of dementia has features that can be quite different from management of other diseases and can be quite challenging for the immediate family. We will explore some of these challenges. Bharath, please.
Video. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Shyam. This is not going to be a very academic talk, because I know a little sacrilegious to say that coming from a professor in a university setting. Shyam mentioned in the introduction that I have over 7 years experience in being the primary caregiver of a family member. The family member in particular is my wife, who changed from a sparkling, brilliant woman to what she is now today, a little baby who cannot communicate, who cannot express. And I was party to this journey, and it's the nature of dementia that the patient never goes through it alone. The caregiver walks the same path or walks a parallel path with slightly different features. And it's one of those things that, once you've been a caregiver for a dementia patient, and when it's someone as close to you as a spouse, it changes you permanently. Hopefully for the better, but it changes you. It is not something it's not a casual incident in life. And it makes you question a lot of things. It makes you question the very things that we spend much of our time on the planet fighting about, dreaming about, and so on. But anyway, I'm not going to go so much into those aspects of dementia care, the philosophical underpinnings of it all. But I do want to talk about dementia care. It is very different from caring for somebody, as I've said, in paying with a heart attack or with a kidney disease, not in the least to minimize the suffering of both patients and caregivers in those settings, but there's a lot that is different here. And with that, let me start. My hope is to just bring in awareness of dementia and its management to a broader group of people. Okay, so what is dementia, first of all? Okay, so as I said, it's not going to be very academic. In fact, you'll find that I've got some references at the end. They're all website, not a textbook, not a research paper. And every now and then I'll put in a little note. So this is from the National Institutes of Health, USA. It's a loss of cognitive functions. Okay? Cognitive functions are basically how you take in sensory inputs and you make sense of the world around, right? How do you represent the world and so on. And for most of us, that goes under various names of thinking, remembering, reasoning, a sense of time, and so on and so forth. So you lose those functions in smaller or greater measure at different times. The important thing with dementia is not a disease by itself. Dementia stands for a body of symptoms, so otherwise known as a syndrome. Okay, it's a condition characterized by a body of symptoms. And not all of these have to occur, but you'll know when it does occur. It's associated with aging, but It's different from normal aging. That's important to remember. It's not the same sort of thing that you see with your grandparents, a little forgetfulness here and there. But it's not restricted to aging. It's not. There is a correlation, however. Okay, now I'm going to get back to this very quickly because that's going to be the focus in some sense of dementia care. But this is from the Mayo Clinic website, Mayo Clinic Rochester, USA. They're very well known for in the health field. So what are the cognitive changes that one can see? Typically, one sees memory loss, and I'll talk about that. And that's often noticed by someone else. The patient doesn't necessarily see that themselves or will not accept it. Difficulty communicating or finding words. And I'll just read this out. I'll come back to some of them on a more personal level later on. Difficulty with visual and spatial abilities, such as getting lost while driving. Difficulty reasoning or problem solving. Difficulty handling complex tasks. Difficulty with planning and organizing, difficulty with coordination and motor functions, confusion, disorientation. And then there's psychological changes, personality changes, depression, anxiety, inappropriate behavior, paranoia, agitation, hallucinations. And then there's physical changes as well. Gait and motor issues, balance, rigid muscles, muscle spasms, loss of control or fine facial muscles, the inability to swallow, loss of all muscle control. All of these, in some measure, are symptoms of dementia. They go under the full body of the whole package, the syndrome called dementia. And I do want to point out, and we'll speak more in just a few slides, memory loss is the one that most people associate with dementia. But it's important to remember that that's not always the case. Yes, it happens in many situations, but in and of itself, it's not the most important one. There's so many other things when it comes to management of the patient that are really important. And in many cases of dementia, memory loss may not happen at all. These other issues are much more important. Okay, so what's happening underneath the hood, so to speak, when you see these symptoms on the outside? So as I said, dementia is a syndrome. The underlying cause is various forms of brain pathology. And that could be an actual disease where the neurons are actually damaged, or maybe there's a tumor in there growing. So the brain diseases, what happens is neurons, which is the brain cells, these have been compromised or destroyed by various protein deposits. There's some theories we'll talk about in a minute. Sometimes within the neurons, like the tau tangles, or sometime around it, like the beta amyloid plaques. And they could also be blood supply issues. That's the other thing. When blood supply is compromised, then again, the neurons don't function as they should. Okay, so that's what's going underneath, happening underneath, these things. But the symptoms that you see are what's important from a caregiver point of view. So depending on where and what sorts of protein deposits, or if there's a blood supply issue, for instance, where is that choking happening, we can get various combinations of symptoms. Right? Now, this is the thing. The most common form observed is Alzheimer's. Something like 60 to 70% of dementia cases are reported to be Alzheimer's. And this is the reason why there's all this fungibility, this sort of interchangeability in the general public about dementia and Alzheimer's and memory. They all are like interchangeable in most people's memories. But we here as students, psychologists, caregivers, we need to keep the distinction apart. We need to, especially as caregivers, we need to keep the distinction apart. There's a lot more going on there, okay? So yes, once again, dementia is a body of symptoms. Underneath, there's a bunch of processes happening many different kinds, all of which could lead to some combination of these symptoms. And yes, the most common one is Alzheimer's, which among other things leads to memory issues, but it's not the only one. Okay. So typically what the underlying disease is only detected after the person has died during an autopsy. Okay, that's what makes this very hard to detect as well. Right? You can't really peek into a brain and figure out exactly what's happening. But you do have PET scans that can pick up on some disease processes, like Alzheimer's. Okay, the question then becomes, when it comes to management, why would you want to? Right? Why bother? Because to be honest, we talked a little bit about it too. There really isn't much that you can do in terms of curing somebody with any of these diseases. Knowing it's an Alzheimer's disease, maybe at some level, you have this sense of order, you want to know, but it really makes no difference at this point in time. So just briefly about the disease processes. The most common one, Alzheimer's disease, you have these amyloid beta plaques in the regions around the neurons, and these things called tau tangles inside the neurons. And you see this this picture here. This is from Alzheimer's thing.net, something.net, I forget. So this is a brain without the disease, and then you can see all the black stuff. And this is what's interesting. I hope you can see the faded part outside. See the volume of the new Alzheimer brain compared to the original one, it has shrunk. Okay, so that's kind of what is happening. Okay, now, so these are particular proteins, amyloid beta and then tau. They're just names of two proteins that are normal byproducts of brain metabolism. They should get washed away under normal processes. They don't, and they form these plaques for the beta amyloids and the tau tangles. And what happens is the beta amyloids are around the neuron, and the tau tangles are actually inside the neuron. And so they actually affect the communication between one neuron and another. Okay. The next most common one is vascular dementia. That's when you have the interrupted blood supply. I want to go back for a minute, I'm sorry. I forgot to read that. What you see affects memory, learning, executive skills, personality. So everybody thinks of memory, but it actually affects all of them. Learning, executive skills, personality. Executive skills are like, should I do this or should I do that? If I do this and I do this, what should I do next? That sort of thing. Okay, so it's not just one thing. Okay, so vascular dementia comes from strokes, mini strokes, and there's a good reason to have your blood pressure checked regularly as you get older and keep it under control, because high blood pressure leads the possibility of strokes is much higher, right? It affects white matter. White matter is basically bundles of axons. Axons, as you know, are these big communication channels of the neuron where it sends the signal out from the soma, right? And it causes confusion, thinking, executive skills, memory, gait. Again, you see there's a whole body of symptoms there. Lewy body dementia, again, that's a different protein this time. It's called alpha-synuclein, and that spreads around in the brain, and it causes hallucinations, thinking problems, apathy. Okay, not one, but several. Frontotemporal dementia, it affects the frontal and temporal lobes, and it shows up in, again, behavior, personality, thinking problems, judgment. Sorry about that. Oh, there we go. And language and movement. Okay, so there's a lot of them. And then lots of others. Okay, actually, there's like 80 or 90 different causes that have been identified at the brain level for this body of symptoms. Now, my wife's didn't fall into one of these. They didn't even have a name for it. There's a generic name called Parkinsonism. All it means is it has symptoms similar to those that come from Parkinson's, specifically rigidity, some tremors, muscle spasms, and so on. But it just fell between the cracks in terms of what neurologists could determine. Before I do that, so I should tell you this. Today, the way the state of play is in this, most neurologists would not come to one conclusion that this patient has this particular kind of dementia. Alzheimer's, if it's pronounced, yes, people will more or less agree. But if it's anything else, you will find disagreement. And for example, in my wife's case, one neurologist called it Parkinsonism, which is a catch-all term. Just like dementia is a catch-all term for a bunch of symptoms, Parkinsonism is a catch-all term for, I don't know what's going on, but it looks like this, right? That's what it means. One person went, stuck their neck out and said it's Lewy body dementia. It's not Lewy body dementia because there were no hallucinations there. My psychiatrist at Nightingale's Medical Center in Bangalore called it PSP, which is Progressive Supranuclear Palsy. And she might actually be right, I think, because I read up later, PSP affects focus and control of eyes. And my wife cannot focus her eyes at all. She just stares like that. So the point is, it's all about management. I'll come back. From a brain research point of view, the field is wide open. There's a lot of work going on, no question about it. There's a lot of work going on, immense amount of money, competition. There's also fraud, which we'll talk about briefly. We know about that. But it's wide open because we know so little of what's going on at the brain level and how it translates into these various symptoms that we see. All we can do is keep the patient comfortable. Okay. Now, there are some, so dementia is progressive by and large. In the sense, it only gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. There are a few cases of reversible dementia, very rare, and that happens because of these temporary conditions that you've had an infection, and that's some immune disorder, some metabolic problems, so maybe this happens a lot. I mean, I feel it happen to people around me. Your sodium levels could drop for some reason. 135, as I seem to remember, is a number. It comes to 125, you're suddenly woozy, and you're like, just had a joint or something. I mean, these sort of things can happen. Lack of proper kinds of B vitamins, B12 is implicated in this, B3, B6, bleeding in the brain tumors, normal pressure, hydrocephalus. That is reversed. And there's I'm going to share a very sad story, a sad, sweet story on this one. So what is normal pressure hydrocephalus? So that's when, for whatever reason, the pressure builds up in the brain. And when the pressure builds up, I mean, there's fluid around, cerebrospinal fluid, whatever. And those things have a pressure. And when the fluid builds up, some things don't function as you might expect. And, various forms of dementia occur. So a close friend of mine, she had I could tell, she had a very troubled relationship with her father. Because to me, her father had some form of Alzheimer's. He would start wandering up, he'd wander away from home and so on. And she has grown up with the image of this father who was sort of not there supporting her mother. And that's obviously a very complicated relation to deal with. There's a sense of my father is not quite up to snuff. He doesn't cut it. And, as a child growing up, it's a very complicated relationship. And 2-3 years ago, and this was all in India, 2-3 years ago, they'd all since moved to California. He had a series of strokes. And so he went through a whole bunch of neurological examinations, surgeries, what have you. And they discovered that he has this normal pressure I don't even know how to say it, hydrocephalus. It was the first time my friend had heard of it. So along with treating the tumor, they took care of this. And a new father came into my friend's life, and she was just struck that this is the father I wanted all along. A very loving man who was completely with it, who knew what was going on around the world, was sensitive to his wife, her mother, etc., etc. And I could tell she was just struck with both love at that time and guilt for all her feeling, all complicated emotions. And you want to say, oh my God, if this could have been done like 40 years ago or whatever. Right? Anyway, that feeding lasted for 2 months because in 2 months, other complications came and the father eventually passed away. Good, because he was suffering. But things happen. Okay, there have been some recent medications, but there have been all kinds of problems as well. Okay, the first one is this thing that I can't even pronounce them, aducanumab. And what it does is it reduces beta amyloid plaques. And it was fast-tracked by the FDA, Food and Drug Administration in the US. Horrible side effects that include swelling in the brain and bleeding, okay? Even when they approved of it, there were 2 major studies that had been done on this drug, and one showed some improvement on the clinical side. That is, in terms of what it does to the behavior, the symptoms, what it does to the quality of life. And while it did seem to reduce the amount of amyloid plaques, which are the source of a lot of these problems, one test came out positive, but the other test came out negative. And yet the FDA said, let's go ahead with it because it's a critical drug. So the problem with this is, because of all these side effects, right? The whole process is very expensive. You need to get injected every 4 weeks, and you have to be monitored with an MRI constantly to see if there's pressure buildup and so on and so forth. And I saw somewhere like right now it's $56,000 a year. I mean, that's a lot of money. Okay, this news is very recent. This is the news of the last 2 weeks. This thing called lecanemab. Again, very similar to the above, but according to the people who put this out, it's a combination of Biogen and a Japanese company, I forget the name. They've done a test and they've shown a 27% increase or improvement in whatever parameters they were measuring at the clinical level. That is in terms of memory and so on and so forth, downstream, not just at the reduction of the plaque level. But that's not gone in for FDA approval or anything. But same problems. You have to put it in through a cannula every 2 weeks. Same issues with risks of high bleeding and so on, high pressure buildup in the brain. You got to constantly check MRI and so on and so forth. Right? And then they have other things called memantine. It works on symptoms, not at the level of plaques, but it goes and changes the communication between neurons, changes certain neurotransmitters, certain proportions in the right place, and it seems to help in some cases. Memantine works early. It works if it's taken early, but all they do is they delay the symptoms. Okay. End of the day, as a caregiver, your job is to see what's the best for the patient. Sometimes it's good to delay things. Sometimes you question, do you really want that to happen? Because there may be other problems associated with it, right? Yeah. Oh, how did this come here? Okay. I'm going to, this is not too much. Just be aware that on the clinical side, they have various ways of, categorizing it into various stages. So just be aware. There is some yardstick, some rubric. And the important thing is that while it's kind of nice to know, oh, my patient is in the 7th stage, my patient is in the 6th stage, it's not to be taken too seriously because many patients will show activity between the 2 stages. Different people vary differently. Some people ask, what's the, I keep forgetting, do I have Alzheimer's? Okay, so here is something from NIH. What's the difference between normal aging and Alzheimer's disease, specifically Alzheimer's disease? Okay, so you make a bad decision once in a while. Alzheimer's, you make poor judgments and decisions, a lot of it. Okay, so all of this is a judgment call as to it. Does it fall into this bucket or that bucket? And it's not a one-time thing. You look at several factors, right? You miss a monthly payment, that happens. You're constantly having problem taking care of monthly bills. You forget which day it is, but you remember it later. here you lose track of the date or time of the year. You're completely lost. You know, often Alzheimer's patients are living 20 years ago. In their mind, that's the world around. It's the world of 20 years ago. Okay. Right. Sometimes forgetting which word to use. Alzheimer's disease, you have trouble having a conversation. Normal aging, you lose things from time to time. Alzheimer's disease, you misplace things often and you're being unable to find. Okay. A general yardstick is normal aging. Yes, you get forgetful. That's just, you know, like your muscles weaken and whatever, your skin starts to wrinkle and all that sort of thing. You know, various things happen in the brain. The hippocampus, which is where the short-term memories are converted to long-term memories and so on, that starts to shrink a little bit, and maybe the production of the neurotransmitters, Professor Shyam would be an expert on that, actually, speak in front of him. Maybe the production of neurotransmitters goes down a bit as you get older and so on. That just happens. Life stuff, you get old and then you die, as they say, what happens. But that's not the same as Alzheimer's disease, right? This is something clinically not good and is going to get pretty bad after a while. You know, this is surprised by this happen. Okay, let me go to that. Okay, let's talk about caregiving, because that's kind of where, you know, as they say, when the rubber hits the road. I mean, theory is all well, but the theory is nowhere where it's going to actually help you taking care of someone. Okay, so what do you do when you take care of someone? The first thing to remember is this. All those nice categories, like Alzheimer's has these kinds of symptoms, and vascular dementia has this kind of symptom, and this has this kind of symptom, become irrelevant after a while. Because one thing to remember, all these dementias, as the dementia progresses, meaning the brain cells more and more get destroyed, they all start showing the same symptoms. Eventually, they all start showing the same symptoms. So what do you need to do? Caregiver has to be prepared. As I said, there to be tested like they've never been tested before on several fronts. It's really very hard for the caregiver. I mean, I'm not saying for pity, please take care, please take care. I'm not saying it for that. It's serious. I mean, you're a psychology student. So I really would like you to understand. It's they say that for every dementia patient, there is one other patient in the room, their caregiver. Okay, so they have to be tested on several fronts: tolerance, physical energy, flexibility and mental flexibility, willingness to teach oneself. You're tested on your love for the patient, including making difficult decisions on their behalf. Okay, tolerance. The behavior of your loved one is going to surprise you, disappoint you, infuriate you. Because maybe you've not yet, this is in the beginning phases, when you don't know yet that this person has dementia, typically. So, for example, in my wife's case, 2008, we're talking 14 years ago, she started withdrawing from society, a very gregarious person, started withdrawing from society. I mean, little by little, but I mean, I would know. I mean, instead of making 10 phone calls a day, she only made 8. I would know that, right? Little by little. But it was 2014 before it sort of started becoming clear to me and her immediate family who was nearby. Oh, that's the sequence of things that has happened is not normal. There's something wrong. And that's when we started, I took her to a neurologist and all that and took some tests and it came back. So that intervening, in my case, 6 years, for others could be longer, you might find you've been quite angry. You might find your spouse or your father, your mother, whatever, they're breaking this compact that you've had. You should be well behaved, you should respond, and you be responsible, and so on and so forth. So at least there at that phase, you can be excused because you didn't know that where this is coming from. But once you know that it's dementia, then too you're tested, because the behavior can be so bizarre that even with your knowledge, sometimes you're just exasperated. Now, I was spared some of the kind of behaviors that other dementia patients have. But typical dementia patients, people can get really angry. People can throw tantrums. People can just walk out of the house, they don't care about you, get lost, and you're spending nights upon nights searching for them. They can throw their clothes open in public, inappropriate behaviors, all sorts of things. And you got to say, no, sweetheart, I love you, please come back. It's really testing you, right? It's not normal. It's really not normal. Physical energy, the amount of time you have to spend. Okay. So pretty soon, all these dementias lead to a loss of physical control. And gait will become a problem, no matter where it starts, whether it starts as Alzheimer's or this, eventually they lead up there. And fairly quickly, once we started getting the diagnosis, there were gait issues. So you've got to present yourself all the time. So in my case, for example, 2 years I took care of her while we were still in the US, and in the US, you don't have help of the kind that you have here. So you have to I had to lead a double life, right? Because she had there was apathy. She couldn't do things for herself. She was still physically mobile and all that, but I'd be afraid of falls. So I got to lay out her clothes. I got to go shop. I got to cook. And that's not enough. I got to go put the plate on a thing, give her a fork, and then I just start eating, and then make sure she's eating, come back, put it back, wash the dishes, make sure she hasn't fallen off, take her up, have her change her clothes. She'll do it, but you got to do it for her. And that's when she's still with it. I mean, she can still do her own toiletry and stuff like that. Once the patient is beyond that stage, which happens, then you got to move the patient, take the patient into the bathroom, figure out how to give a bath to the patient, and so on and so forth. It's very, very hard. You would have seen this. Simply taking a patient off and setting them on a wheelchair is an enormously complicated process. Right? Now, I should tell you that the reason after 40 years in the US, I moved back to India because I needed the kind of help I can get here. Right? I can't do this on my own. And I'm not a moment has gone by when I'm grateful for the help I got here. I would have always 2 young women from an agency, so like a family. And yes, I would also help in and do the lifting and all that. But they help me take care of much of that. It's exhausting. It's very exhausting. Okay. Flexibility. That's again flexibility of thought, right? Flexibility of thought is you need to be able to go with the flow, right? Absolutely go with the flow. One day your father is doing something this way, the other day the father is doing something way. You just have to switch gears and go with that. Okay, willingness to teach oneself. Again, that part of that mental flexibility. You got to say, okay, I learned something from that person. I learned something from this person. And yeah, love for the patient. I mean, that you're tested constantly because it's exasperating. It's really exasperating. And you have to learn to make tough decisions. I've already made one, and I might have to make another fairly soon. My wife was in ICU for a while. Massive infection, which I still blame myself for not catching it early enough. And they wanted to put her, she was ICU, they wanted to put her on a ventilator. I had to say no. Right? I was supported in that by the very same doctors who asked me, because it's by law they have to ask me, is it okay to put your wife on a ventilator? And then they said, don't give me an answer yet. They took me out to the side and said, don't do it. And I checked with a couple of other doctors, and yeah, the risks far outweigh the rewards. And when you're in positions like this, you start to question, what's the value of a life that is just being lived, right? If there is no quality of life, and so on. And other doctors said that. So I said no. And sure enough, when this happens, there's a whole bunch of other family members who are not there doing the 24/7 caring and all that, being in and getting really angry because, why didn't you not put the ventilator, right? Yeah, family relations break. All that happens is just part of what goes on. Okay, what is before that? This is something that's called Caregiver's 10 Commandments. It's just techniques. It's good. One of the point, the philosophy behind this overall is this was less so of my wife, who fairly early couldn't stop communicating. She cannot communicate even now. But for a lot of other patients, that comes much later. And what does happen is, depending on what's really happening, they're typically living in a very different reality. Somebody might be living in the 1940s. Actually, that's the world. That's how they're seeing things. It's the 1940s. And they may be surprised. And they could live in the 1940s and they're seeing something that is not in sync with how they think the world in the 1940s should have been. And it frightens them. It frightens them. So a lot of the behavior comes, and they play it out using aggression, verbal aggression. Males often use physical aggression, but it's not just males. Females also get aggressive physically. And the thing as a caregiver, the basic principle is, do not go against their reality. Right? Just understand where they're coming from. They're frightened. If they're talking about a hallucination, they say, "Oh, I just saw so and so. I just saw Ravi walk in," and you got to sort of deflect it. Yeah, you say, "Yeah, Ravi walked in, but I think he has to go get something from the market or something." Just sort of gently deflect. Do not say, "Oh, Ravi's been dead for 30 years." Don't say that, right? That's the sort of techniques you want to keep in mind. Now, it's good to know these, but my experience and having talked to other caregivers is, a lot of it we just learn on the spot, and we know we figure it out. But this is a good set of principle to keep in mind. As a consequence, right? You agree. You never argue with the person. You redirect. You distract. You never shame. You reassure. You never lecture. You reminisce. Don't you remember this? No. Don't say that, right? Say, hey, let's, do you remember when you and I went on this cruise? As opposed to, don't you remember we went on this cruise? There's a big difference, right? And what happens is, as well, especially in the beginning stages, dementia patients are aware of their deficits, and it makes them anxious. So when you say, don't you remember, and they don't remember, they become frightened. And they become frightened, and, well, you don't want to fight to begin with, but also they act out on that fear. It's a positive feedback kind of a thing, and that's not a good thing. So you have to try and be as reassuring as you can, right? Repeat, never say, "I already told you," don't, okay? And so on. You ask, never command. You encourage and praise, never condescend. You reinforce, never force. Okay, that's what I talked about. What does the caregiver have to endure? Stress and grief. Stress and grief. Stress and grief. And depression, loss of pride, helplessness, serious stuff. That's why I said, the dementia patients always come in two. There's the dementia patient and their caregiver. It's serious. There's a lot of stress because this is minute by minute unpredictability, management of health, and so on. There's no rule book on this. If you're taking care of a heart patient, stressful as it is, I was just involved with something like that too. It's very stressful, no question about it. But we know the playbook on that. We know what to expect. We know what the tools are. It's a fairly well-developed thing. That is not true in dementia. With health, for example, with a heart patient, there are very well-defined trajectories for the patient. This is how the patient is going to behave. This is how this disease is going to evolve. This is what you should look for. Right? This maybe your O2 levels will drop because the lungs aren't pumping out. Whatever, you know all that. You can write a playbook. That's not true with dementia. There's no real manual for caregivers of dementia because each patient is different and we do not understand the science that is happening behind it. Okay, so minute by minute unpredictability. And of course, like with anything else, anything can happen. Right? The minute by minute unpredictability is almost as a psychological alert. We don't know what the patient will do next. Suddenly take the clothes off in public, right? I used that example earlier. You're least expecting it, right? things of that nature suddenly get violent. Why? Because something has frightened them. You don't know what it is. Oh, another thing I should mention, there's this notion of sundowning. Maybe you've heard of that. That's very common among dementia patients. So the idea is, as the sun goes down, sundowning, the cognitive strength that is of the patient has come down. They put in as much energy as they could trying to figure out the world around them. And now they've run out of that energy. And so as a result, they have things frighten them. They understand less and less. So they start acting out more and more. And you have to deal with that. Management of health. I mean, a number of UTIs have had to deal with. Urinary tract infections, so on and so forth, because these things happen. If the patient is bedridden, you have to worry about bed sores. Now, that part is common with other things, of course. Grief is what is not understood by the public. So the thing with grief is, as I said, there's something called dementia. Now, not to minimize any other kind of grief. Grief is bad. But when let's say your father has died or your wife has died, society around you understands it. And they acknowledge it, they validate it, they give you space to heal. Society does not understand how grief occurs in dementia. And this you have to live through to feel it. See, the thing is, I always say it this way. Your spouse or your father could have 2 out of 4 valves blocked, have 1 out of 2 kidneys function. And you will know your father to be the very father you've known your entire life. That's the same person. The person is there. Yeah, maybe a couple of valves are missing, a couple of kidneys, or 1 kidney is missing, but the person is there. When you're in the situation, you realize the person who you think of as a person is this combination of memories, of shared reality. You've done things together. It's a measure of the person's functionality or functionability, what's the right word. The fact that they can do this, they can reason. Here are their tastes, they can perceive this, right? That is what makes a person person. And when that starts to disappear little by little, each time you see something disappear, you're hit with grief. And even for the dementia caregiver, it takes a while before they recognize it to be grief. But it is grief all the same, right? So, for example, a person is very Eurocentric because it's so important to drive there. A person suddenly cannot drive. That's a functionality that has gone. Now, at one level, yeah, it's inconvenience and all that. But at another level, you realize this is a totally functioning person who suddenly cannot do as simple a thing as driving. A person can't work on a computer. You've lost that ability. Now, it gets worse. Suddenly, a person cannot walk. And in my case, very early on, my wife stopped communicating. She couldn't. Just junk syllables came out. So you lose your wife. How do you communicate? Just junk syllables. That's how it sounds. As I say, after a while, what you communicate is the desire to communicate, but you don't communicate. Each one of these is a grieving process. The problem with that is, as they call it, disenfranchised. People don't understand it. People don't have time for it. Precisely when you want the support of your friends and your community, they'll make the right noises. Oh, yeah, poor guy, his wife's not well. His dad, they're taking care of the dad. But they don't see the grief part. They can't. It's bizarre. They don't get it. And that's kind of really hard to deal with. It just goes on and on. It's just, and dementia, you don't go like this, right? You go like that, and then something goes. And you go like that, then something else goes. You go like that, something else goes. And each time, there's waves of grief. It goes on over a long period of time. Yeah, along with that, depression, loss of drive, certain degree of helplessness. You're taking care of this person. Unlike taking care of a child, assuming the child is healthy and no problems, that's a plant you're nurturing. You're going to go up and be a productive member, whatever, bring joy, all that sort of thing. Unlike that case, you just do your best to keep the person comfortable, and they're going to go one day. You can just hope that it's done with as little pain as possible. Caregiving, it's really important caregivers learn to cope. For me, was Aerobic, the first two, aerobic exercise. I tried much as I can, at least every other day I go cycling or go to the gym and get on a elliptical machine or something, or swimming. Yoga, meditation, I did that. I do that. I've been doing that for like 20, 25 years, every day, pretty much every day without fail. It's really important to connect with other caregivers of dementia patients, because again, that's something that the sort of things that one goes through, it's just somebody else who has gone through it would really understand what's involved, the minute by minute mechanics. Even if somebody has seen dementia up close in person, may not have been a caregiver, but maybe, I don't know, maybe the grandfather was unaware that they could see that, they would understand what you're going through. Others may not. And you know, that's just the way it is. I can't blame them. It's too far removed from their experiences. Psychotherapy helps. It really helps. What does the caregiver gain? Actually, there is a lot to be gained. And let's put them all. I mean, really take into very unusual depths of the human condition. Things that most people won't see. And sometimes you feel privileged for having seen that. Quite privileged, actually, to see, you know, that. And it's strange, but that's how it is. And essentially all assumptions about life get challenged. I mean, even at a sort of, you know, even at a scientific level, you sort of realize, okay, so there is something around us. Sensations are coming into the brain. And most of us appear to take these sensations, these sights and sounds and all that, touch and all that, and we are creating a representation of the world that more or less most of us, we are agreeing on. I think most of us will agree there's a classroom here with chairs that have a writing board that we agree is of a color called brownish, and that there's so many students sitting around, etc. But a dementia patient could take the same thing in and conjure it as something else. I mean, maybe they're going through hallucinations at that point, or maybe they're thinking this is a 1940 era thing and they're looking at creating a different reality. And then you question, who's to say their reality is wrong and yours is right? Right? I mean, really, maybe that's perfectly right too. Right? And then that leaves you sort of questioning things, and I don't have an answer to that one. And yeah, this is stuff. And anytime you go through this empathy, gratitude, there's also a sense of being blessed because you're sort of chosen for something very special trek through life, a special vistas. You get to see things that, you know, you have others aren't, as I would say, privileged to see. I'd rather if people don't see it, frankly. But if you have, then, you know, it is something. And I know this is not the right thing to say in an academic institution where, you know, we talk about theories and, you know, left versus right, you know, nice little things, but I have to put my pitch in. Yeah, love as a center. I mean, I have to say, look, I mean, you've gone through all this whole stuff that the world is bickering over. It seems like a pile of pardon BS, right? I mean, that's not what makes the world go round. It doesn't. You realize that's kind of what matters. I mean, you might still fight for the little guy, but you don't matter the big guy anymore for pushing down the little guy. You know, that's the sort of. Okay, now how do you? How long does it go? 10 minutes. Okay. Yeah. What do you do for lowering the chances of dementia? The most important thing is active socialization. Actually, that has been shown to be the most important thing. Just talking to people, that stretches the brain. It makes you feel more comfortable, more connected. Active, and then that's, by the way, a good reason also for the senior living centers. Like many of you, maybe you're too young for that, but maybe your parents are going through that. Maybe you're worrying that they're worrying that the grandparents are living alone. Okay, and they want to bring them to your house. Actually, that need not be a good thing, because you know you all will have your own lives. Your parents are off working somewhere, etc. Better off would be a senior living center where there's a whole bunch of people of the same age group and hopefully similar interests, because there's constant socialization going on. That's much better in terms of, well, they're happy as long as somebody's around to check in on them in case of emergencies. It just keeps them happier and is better in terms of dementia busting. Aerobic exercise, that's a definite must. Blood flow to the brain is super critical. Hearing losses, that's surprising, but I saw some study where something like 8% of cases, sort of, I don't know how they measured it, but something like there's an 8% contribution of hearing losses to dementia. And it might just be that that's kind of where you really get your sense of the world from. And if that goes, maybe, I don't know what it is, but you do want to fix that. Blood pressure, keep under control, because again, if that goes out of whack, you're more likely to have strokes, including mini strokes, lots of mini strokes. And these TIAs, you've heard of them, temporary ischemic attacks, just things that come and go like that. Short bursts of short strokes that come and then just release themselves. So that cannot be good for the brain. Sleep, that's extremely important. Sleep is extremely important. I don't know how well backed this theory is, but the one theory at least is much of, so like with any metabolic process, the metabolic process in the brain produce junk proteins, so junk of which many are proteins. And you need to sweep them away, otherwise they accumulate. And it's theorized that sleep is when much of that cleaning away happens. And when that sleep is disrupted is when these proteins accumulate, these beta amyloids and tau tangles and alpha synucleins and so on. And there's something called cognitive reserve. Sort of not the best defined, but it basically, it's a measure of tolerating brain pathology and still function. So the idea is that even though your brain's been damaged, you're still functioning, even though the theory says you should have been demented by now, but you're still functioning. So how does that occur? I mean, typically it occurs with higher education attainment. At least in the US, there seems to be, where they're measuring all these things, there seems to be a correlation between dementia and lower educational attainment. Also high functioning occupations that have a greater cognitive demand, right? So, I mean, they tell you to go do Sudoku. I don't know if doing Sudoku every day is necessarily what it is, but just being involved in challenging situations. And socialization is extremely challenging because human beings, there's one, every human being is a flavor of his or her own. And, you have to adjust constantly to each human being as you're interacting with them, right? But yes, staying intellectually active is good. Okay, so I said this is not much of an academic talk as such, no textbooks, but there are some good, I use some of these sources for a few of the slides. And these sources I'm talking, they want the information to go around. So the first one, the first one is this National Institutes of Health of the US. Part of that is National Institutes of Aging, and there's a whole bunch of things there on Alzheimer's. Second one is Mayo Clinic. Again, that's a major hospital complex in Minnesota. And then there's a bunch of others that, this one's very good, alzheimers.org.uk, advocacy caregiving. So that's what they're focusing on. alzheimersdisease.net, as well as alzheimersweekly.com. These are both caregiver organized. So again, there's a community of caregivers that recognizes that we all need to be talking to one another. There's Teepa Snow's videos on caregiving that I would recommend. Indian organizations, the one where my wife is at right now, I was forced to take her in after, I took care of her for 5 years on my own, well, with help, but I took care of her at home. I was forced to find an institution for her because she needed help that technically I was no longer capable of giving that help. She was choking and so on. So this is Nightingale Center for Aging and Alzheimer's. Nightingale's Medical Trust, that's in Bangalore. They're very well known. They have been in business, so to speak, for about 10 years. It's a trust. They do amazing work. They really do amazing work. And then the bigger one with the greater reach is ARDSI, Alzheimer's and Related Disorders Society of India. According to their website, they're in about 24 cities. What they do is they do advocacy, they do training of caregivers and so on, and they have a couple of helpline numbers. What we really need, I'm hoping that, as young psych graduates, you'll be enthused. Dementia is going to be a big problem in India as well. It's just because of population ages, we're beating the usual infectious disease stuff. People are going to live for longer. And once you live longer, these brain pathologies start to arise. What we need are a lot more people trained in dementia care. We need lots more centers like Nightingale centers that are full-fledged memory care centers. I'm just hoping that, some here at least will go into that field. There will be a lot of opportunities in this field. There has to be. But the first batch will probably have to set up your own. You go out there and make a splash. I am trying to get Professor Saba Siddiqui is also here, something going with Nightingales. I thought we had a internship program started, but I guess it's not 100% started yet. We got to kickstart that. But yes, you can hopefully intern there too. A good movie to watch. This one is in Kannada, Godi Banna Sadharana Maikattu. That's Anant Nag's dad and Shruti Hariharan as psychiatrist. They won the Best Actress Awards, Filmfare South India Awards. So that's actually based on Nightingales. In fact, Shruti Hariharan, I think, modeled herself after the psychiatrist there, who's now a good friend of mine. And I didn't have the pleasure and privilege as well of talking to Shruti Hariharan later on an unrelated matter. We met on Zoom or something else, and I thanked her for making the movie because it really spoke to me. Just what's involved in dementia care and kind of concerns people around them have. That movie was a hit. It was remade as Aruvaduvayadu Maniram Tamil with Prakash Raj playing the same role that Anant Nag does. The story is a dad who walks away, basically, an Alzheimer's patient who walks away. This one I haven't seen. There's a movie called House Owner. It's about an older couple dealing with Alzheimer's. It's set around the floods in Chennai in 2015. Okay. Do we have time for that? Oh, okay. I just wanted to share it's kind of Love That Matters. It's a very short film I found. It's in Thai, but English subtitles.
คุณจำผมไม่ได้
YouTube, no?
แต่ผมจำคุณได้ คุณชื่อวันดี สามีชื่อบุญส่ง
Can you see the subtitles? No, yeah, I thought we were doing the bigger thing on YouTube. We were doing it separately on YouTube. I'm sorry?
Online won't be able to see it.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, apparently the people online may not be able to see it if we.
คุณเป็นคนรักต้นไม้
No.
ชอบสีฟ้า
We just started again.
ชื่ออะไร
คุณจำผมไม่ได้ แต่ผมจำคุณได้ คุณชื่อวันดี ส สามีชื่อบุญส่งคุณเป็นคนรักต้นไม้ชอบสีฟ้าใส่รองเท้าเบอร์ 6ขี้หนาวแต่ชอบกินน้ำเย็นชอบแกงเผ็ดแต่ไม่ชอบมะเขือพวงแล้วเวลากินข้าวคุณจะต้องฟังเพลงนี้คุณเป็นคนรักธรรมชาติเส้นตื่นมีระเบียบรักความสะอาดตลกขี้บ่นขี้งอนแล้วก็เป็นอัลไซเมอร์คุณแต่งงานวันที่ 6 กรกฎาคมแล้วผมก็จำคำพูดของผมวันนั้นได้ว่าผมจะดูแลคุณไปตลอดชีวิต
เดินเล่นเหรอ ไม่เหนื่อยเหรอ
ไทยประกันชีวิต
But I mean, I don't know if you got the point of it. He's devastated when she says, "Who are you?" After this, that's just very common. But see how he picks up when she asks, "Will you not be tired?" And that's very common. You're desperately looking for some acknowledgement from your patient of your past life, some caring, and so on. What kept me going was every day, I'd wait for her to smile. My wife has had a brilliant smile, which she can't do anymore. She's lost control of these muscles. But that one smile was enough to keep me going. So we're looking, that's what keeps you going. So I'm basically going to stop here. Why am I not going forward? There you go. I'm just going to leave that on. That's the poem that I wrote sometime, a couple, 3 years ago. But I think should open it up for questions. Yeah, aptly called the caregiver.
Thanks, Bharat, for the enlightening talk. Any questions?
All super clear, right?
Any questions?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question. So you spoke about this US FDA approving monoclonal antibody from this pharmaceutical company called Biogen, right? So on one hand, no, this drug has a very poor clinical efficacy, it's very expensive. On the other hand, no, it attacks the market for Alzheimer's drugs. So the FDA position has been under immense controversy as soon as it approved it. The FDA also approved another drug for muscular dystrophy in the recent, like in the past few years. What is your opinion as a caretaker in FDA's approval? Do you support it or do you oppose it?
My own take is to not. Yeah, I think they acted too soon. Because it gives hope when, and that's very cruel to dash people's hopes if it turns out to not be right. I'd rather after all, they're ultra careful otherwise. They're ultra careful. So why did they throw that kind of caution to the winds this time? I didn't get it. It's not correct. Yeah.
One more question. So could you talk about spatial disorientation symptoms in Alzheimer's or any kind of dementia?
No. I thought that a lot. My wife, it was a very scary thing. You know, we'd be flying back to the US from India, 35,000 feet, and my wife's saying, "No, I want to go." You know, I just left something there. Let's go out the door. Let's go out the door, and she'll walk out. Try to walk out of the plane. 35,000 feet. So you come into a house that she's been living there for a long time, and suddenly she's confused which is the bathroom, which way is the bathroom. This is very common. Inside a house you go, it's a house they know. Suddenly they'll forget which is the kitchen, where is the dining room, and so on. It happens all the time in all these dementias.
Any question? Yeah.
Do you think it's still possible to experience meaningfulness even in this kind of condition?
Meaningfulness. It's from the caregiver's point of view, yes, that's what I was trying to say. I don't know what's happening in the dementia patients. I don't know what my wife cannot communicate, has not been able to communicate for nearly 4 years now. I have no idea what she's feeling, but it's been a very meaningful experience for me. No question about it. Because it also, see, one of the things you have to say when you go through this is, you don't want to ever act in a way that makes you regret for the next 20, 30 years. And so you're doing the right thing, which is not to say I did not make mistakes. I made some glaring mistakes, but there's a sense that, okay, I've done what I should do. You get a lot of meaning. Actually, you get a lot of meaning because you're really deeply connecting with human existence at that point. And you realize the fragility of it all. You realize how much care needs to be given to maintain life and all of that. Even when there's nothing to be gained from it later on. It's not like I said, a life that's going to come out, like with child rearing. I mean, that's extremely meaningful. That's well known. But even here, it's meaningful.
I was just wondering, do usually patients of dementia remember certain small memories? For example, listening to their favorite song. Do they have similar or, some sort of reaction to, say, having their favorite food or listening to a song they were familiar with?
Yeah. So actually, that was not the case with my wife, but it is a very common thing that a lot of people with dementia, the music centers of their brain remain active, specifically music, and that they do respond positively to old songs and music and so on. And in fact, it's a way of entertaining them or keeping them engaged. Very well-known stuff from my extended family, extended family. There's a very well-known, you may have heard a Carnatic musician called Lalgudi Jairam, violinist, classical violinist. And so he's related to a relative of mine. So that's why I know this story. So apparently he had dementia for the last 10 years and just nobody could interact with him. But he picks up the violin, he's the same old Lalgudi. It's very, very common. I don't know quite as much about other things. It depends on the brain. Maybe some smells trigger things, sights could trigger, but music is very well known.
Any other question? One last question, Bharat. Are there any hospitals that specialize in geriatric care in India?
Specialized only in that, I don't know, except for Nightingales. But certainly in Bangalore, I'm seeing a lot of healthcare corporations. I'm using that term advisedly, that are starting to get into geriatric care. And it's one thing to have a doctor who's actually there and who's trained in geriatric care. But the reason I'm saying using the word corporation, a lot of times I'm a little afraid that they're just coming in for purely commercial purposes. I know one or two, and I don't want to mention names here, that come in and promise stuff about, we'll provide you dementia care for your patients and so on and so forth. And I've seen that they're not fully trained. So no, it's not yet a thing. It's not yet a thing in India, as far as I know. It needs to be a thing. Yeah, geriatric care more generally is important.
You and then you.
So you mentioned that, a patient, can you hear me?
I don't know if that's on or not. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned that there are a couple of patients who remember certain periods of their life, dating back to a couple of years. Is there any scientific literature that, explains as to why a dementia patient only remembers certain aspects of their life and not, other memories?
I don't know. Like I said, I've not really studied the literature that well. But Professor Shyam could probably speak more about it. But there are some things that typically what you'll find is the childhood memories as close to childhood as possible, including languages as close to childhood as possible, are the ones that dementia patients resort to towards the end. It may well be that those are the strongest memories, and the other memories start to weaken, and once the disease process sets in, those are disrupted. That's just me, more a layperson say. Yeah, it is true. Languages, for instance, but after a while, you'll find the dementia patient reverts to the language completely of their actual childhood, like under 5, even if they know 5, 6 languages. And like I said, a lot of these memories are from their childhood.
I also just wanted to ask you, how are you doing?
I'm sorry?
How are you doing with?
How do I do it?
How are you doing right now?
Oh, thank you for asking. Oh my God, that makes my day. I got to tell you, my biggest therapists are all of you. I really mean it. I really mean it. There's nothing like being with a bunch of young people to sort of keep the thing going. And seriously, I'm not quitting this job. I don't need this job, but I'm not quitting it. Thank you for asking that. No, it's not. It's been a journey. It's not been easy. It's really not been easy.
So first of all, thank you so much for the lecture. It must have been incredibly hard to be so vulnerable in front of us. So thank you so much for that. And second of all, my question was, I have my grandfather had Parkinson's, but one thing that I noticed very much was, even though he did not really have the ability to understand who his caregivers were, he would not trust anybody except for the caregiver. So how is that, do you think that underlying trust still remains even if the memories are not there?
That's possible, or it may be. I'm no expert on this, but it strikes me just something built into our self-preservation, that we know we got to depend on someone,
right?
And then you bond with someone. So whoever is your grandmother alive?
My grandmother is alive. My grandfather has passed away. My grandfather was the one who was suffering.
Oh, okay. So the grandmother was alive then, yes. Therefore. So he did not remember her? He
remembered, he had a lesser degree of Alzheimer's. His was more Parkinson's, but I know some other people who had proper Alzheimer's, and they would not trust anyone to handle them except for their primary caregiver, right, even though they did not remember who that person was on a day-to-day basis.
Right. So yeah, I can believe that, because I've seen a little bit of that even my wife's case. There is this sense that she developed that somebody's taking care of me. Right. And she would sort of quickly adjust to that person. So I don't know. I'm just, from my base little experience I have, I think there may be a separate circuit that calculates for just simple self-preservation, and you bond quickly. By the way, if you may have noticed this, the moment you change a caregiver, that's a major trauma situation. And I have to deal with that all the time, because I have 2 helpers, and they got family issues. One of them leaves. It takes a week to 10 days to things to stabilize all over again. Because you've seen that, right? And that time is very hard to manage the patient. Yeah.
Any other question? All right, let's take this opportunity to thank. Sorry, Deepti, you can ask him.
No, I just wanted to add or respond. I think so. There's been a lot of literature and what I have seen in community settings and how that contributes to stability in patients who may not be inherently stable. And even like the quality of accepting change, even in patients with dementia and Alzheimer's, grows more. It's subtly, but I've seen it grow. But perhaps each case is different from the rest. But there's a lot. What I've seen is there's a lot of correlation between community living and growth or stability.
Yeah, thank you, Divya. The question.
Go to Sitoshna and then come back.
So you talked about how social interaction is like. You talked about how social interaction is like an important aspect to keep in check. So do you think like COVID-19 might have like propelled people to acquiring these?
More because of this? I don't know specifically dementia, but it is clear that COVID-19 is creating a massive mental health crisis all over the world. I don't know specifically what dementia. Maybe some people on the verge of it as they're older, maybe would have gotten pushed. It's possible, but it's well known. It's creating a major mental health crisis, and particularly in the US, because the US is a very isolated society. Most of interactions come through work and so on and so forth. I could spend a week at my home and not see anybody in the US, just the way it is. Everything's super efficient, and yeah. So I don't know about dementia specifically.
Okay. I just want to know your thoughts because I think you've experienced that, and there's no real answer to this, but why do you think that Indians, like as a community, are not very open to the fact that, if people need help, they should go to like something like Nightingales? Because my grandfather had Parkinson's as well. And I think now that I think of it, maybe if we had extra help, even though we had like nurses who stayed at home, I think, as you mentioned, if we'd gone to some professional place where he's getting 24/7 care, maybe it would have been a little different. So and since you've lived in the US, which is more open and accepting of, going outside and going to somewhere else to stay and get care, what is your opinion on the entire thing? And why is like India progressing, and why do we not accept it?
So I think my guess is it's just how society has been set up historically in India, and yes, it's changing. Historically, we never really had the notion of an institution. I mean, that's it was all family centric and larger community centric, even within the village, community centric and so on. And so you always sought first the family and then the larger community for help. This notion of abstract institutions is relatively new, and something as vulnerable and as something that still carries so much stigma as this. Maybe that's the reason it hasn't taken off. That is something you don't want to look outside for. I don't have a proper answer, just a conjecture. But it has to change, no question about it. Because what's happening is, there are institutions that can provide this. And that will be a much better solution than each person trying to solve it individually and just finding that it sort of wrecks their lives. Yeah, we do need that help. Something as simple as having a lot of daycare centers for dementia patients, that's going to change the lives of so many people. Husbands and wives both are working, and there's grandfather there. And what do you do with the grandfather when you're off to work? And you're worried. You could put a caregiver. Well, it's very expensive. Not everybody can afford this sort of thing. And you're worried, is the person going to have a fall? Will they set the house on fire? Whereas if they're taken care of in the daytime, that can bring so much relief. And just having a network of that in every major city in India would be a big help.
All right, in the interest of time, let's close this talk. Let's take this opportunity to thank Bharat once again. Thank you so much, Bharat.
Thank you.